The sky dawned clear over the hills of Canaan, and the green fields swayed gently in the breeze. Joseph, a 17-year-old, walked among his father Jacob's flocks. There was something special about Joseph. It wasn't just his graceful appearance, with eyes that seemed to mirror the heavens, but also his dreamy spirit and pure heart. To Jacob, Joseph was the reflection of his beloved wife Rachel, which made him his father's favorite. The coat Joseph wore that day shimmered under the sun. It was a gift from Jacob, woven with colorful threads and stitched with care. His brothers watched from a distance, their eyes filled with resentment. To them, that coat was more than just a garment, it was an open declaration of Jacob's favoritism. That evening, as the family gathered around the fire, Joseph spoke up excitedly. "I had a dream. I want to tell you about it." His brothers exchanged wary glances. Still, they motioned for him to continue. Joseph took a deep breath, his eyes alight with enthusiasm. "We were in the field, tying bundles of grain. Suddenly, my bundle stood up and stayed upright, while your bundles gathered around and bowed to mine." A heavy silence followed before Reuben, the eldest, laughed mockingly. "So, you're saying we'll be your servants, Joseph? Is that what you dream of?" Joseph flushed but stood his ground. "It's not just that. I had another dream." This time, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to me. Even Jacob was intrigued this time. He asked, "What does this mean, my son? Are you saying your mother, your brothers, and I will bow down to you?" Though Jacob scolded Joseph for his boldness, he kept those words in his heart. He knew God had a plan for the young man, even if its meaning remained unclear. The brothers, however, didn't share Jacob's reflection. Their hearts burned with anger and envy. In the darkness of that night, they whispered among themselves, plotting how they could rid themselves of Joseph. Little did they know that those dreams, which troubled them so deeply, were only the beginning of something much greater. The sun was already high when Jacob called for Joseph. Sitting in the shade near his tent, Jacob looked troubled. "Your brothers are with the flocks in Dothan," Jacob said, pointing north. "Go check on them and see if they're well. Then bring me word." Joseph readily agreed, always eager to obey. He gathered some bread and water and set out. As he walked across the vast plains, his thoughts returned to the dreams that had so unsettled his brothers. He didn't understand why God had given him those visions, but he believed there was a greater purpose behind them. From a distance, his brothers saw him approaching. The hated multicolored coat was visible even from afar. The anger they had harbored for so long now boiled over in their hearts. "Here comes the dreamer," Simeon sneered. "Why don't we put an end to this once and for all?" Levi suggested, his eyes gleaming with restrained malice. Reuben, though he shared his brother's dislike for Joseph, hesitated. As the eldest, he knew their brother's blood would be on his hands. "We don't have to kill him," he said. "Let's throw him into an empty cistern instead." He hoped to buy time to rescue Joseph later. When Joseph arrived, smiling with confidence, he was met not with warm greetings but rough hands that tore away his multicolored coat. He tried to fight back, but his brothers were too many. "What are you doing? Why are you doing this?" he shouted, but his words echoed into emptiness. They threw him into a dry cistern. Joseph fell hard, the dust choking his breath. He looked up, seeing his brothers' faces, but found no trace of compassion. As Joseph cried out for help, his brothers sat down to eat. Their disdain for him seemed boundless. That was when they spotted a caravan of Ishmaelite merchants, traveling with camels loaded with spices bound for Egypt. Judah, ever practical, proposed. "What will we gain if we kill our brother? Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. After all, he is our own flesh and blood." The others agreed, and Joseph was pulled from the cistern. His eyes were full of tears, but he said nothing. He would not plead. Not now. For 20 pieces of silver, Joseph was sold to the merchants. He glanced back one last time as the camels carried him away. His multicolored coat was now just a strip of cloth in his brother's hands, which they dipped in the blood of a goat. When they returned to Jacob, they presented the bloodied garment. "We found this along the way," they said, feigning sorrow. "See if it belongs to your son." Jacob recognized it immediately. His cries echoed through the tents as he tore his clothes in anguish. "A wild animal has devoured him," he lamented, clutching the fabric as if it were Joseph himself. As Jacob sank into grief, Joseph was taken to a distant land, unaware that his journey was only just beginning. The caravan moved slowly, and the scorching desert sun turned each step into a test of endurance. Joseph walked in silence, his hands bound and his feet bruised by the sharp stones along the path. The dust kicked up by the camels stung his eyes, but he no longer cried. Instead, he looked toward the horizon, trying to discern God's purpose in all this. When they finally reached Egypt, Joseph was both awestruck and afraid. The great pyramids loomed in the distance, surrounded by a river that seemed endless. The grandeur of the place was overwhelming, yet Joseph felt small and insignificant. The merchants led him to the slave market, where he was displayed like a piece of merchandise. A high-ranking officer in Pharaoh's court, named Potiphar, approached. His eyes appraised the slaves with the practiced detachment of someone accustomed to trading lives. "This one," Potiphar said, pointing to Joseph. Joseph was purchased without fanfare and taken to Potiphar's household. The estate was vast, adorned with lush gardens and walls painted with scenes of battles and celebrations. Though now a slave in a foreign land, Joseph resolved in his heart to remain faithful to the God of his fathers. Days turned into weeks, and Joseph quickly stood out among the other servants. His diligence and integrity earned Potiphar's trust, and soon he was entrusted with more significant responsibilities. Before long, Joseph was placed in charge of the entire household. "Since you came, everything has prospered," Potiphar remarked, impressed. "It seems your God is with you." Joseph knew this to be true. Even in an unfamiliar place, he felt God's presence guiding his every step. He managed the household with wisdom, and every decision seemed to bring blessings. But peace would not last long. In the shadowed halls of that grand house, Potiphar's wife watched Joseph. He was young, strong, and carried a calmness that intrigued her. Over time, her interest grew into a dangerous obsession. Unbeknownst to Joseph, God was preparing him for another test of faith. The golden sunlight reflected off the polished walls of Potiphar's house, but inside, the atmosphere was heavy. Joseph, faithful to his duties, walked the corridors with steady steps, unaware of the furtive glances from Potiphar's wife. Day after day, she watched him, intrigued by the serenity he carried, something so rare in a house filled with ambition and intrigue. Finally, her curiosity turned into desire, and she decided to act. "Joseph," she called softly as he organized jars in the storeroom. Joseph looked up, sensing the unusual tone in her voice. He responded politely. "How can I help you, ma'am?" She stepped closer, her hand grazing his cloak. "Potiphar trusts you completely. But you could serve me in another way as well." Her words hung in the air like a threat, and Joseph immediately stepped back, his expression resolute. "Madam, everything in this house has been entrusted to me, everything except you, because you are my master's wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a sin against God." His refusal only fueled her determination. Day after day, she attempted to seduce him, but Joseph remained steadfast, avoiding every trap with wisdom born of his faith. One day, however, when the house was quiet and the servants were away, she saw her chance. Joseph was in the courtyard, tending to the property's records, when she approached him again. "This time, no one is here to save you, Joseph," she said, grabbing hold of his cloak. Realizing there was no reasoning with her, Joseph fled, leaving his cloak behind. He ran through the streets, the hot sand burning his feet, his heart pounding. But Potiphar's wife, enraged by his rejection, began to scream. "This slave tried to attack me," she cried, holding up Joseph's cloak as evidence. Her screams drew the servants and, eventually, Potiphar himself. His face was a mask of fury as he listened to his wife's false accusations. "How dare you betray my trust?" Potiphar roared, refusing to let Joseph speak in his defense. Joseph was taken immediately to prison. Though he knew his integrity was intact before God, the weight of injustice pressed heavily on him. As the heavy prison door slammed shut, the world seemed to grow darker. Yet Joseph knelt in the shadows of his cell. "God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I know you are with me, even here. Teach me to trust your plans." The prison felt like the end, but it was, in truth, the next step in Joseph's journey toward his divine purpose. The prison cells were cold and damp, with stone walls that seemed to swallow daylight whole. Yet Joseph refused to be consumed by the darkness. Though his feet were shackled and his freedom stripped away, his faith remained unshaken. As days passed, Joseph began to earn the trust of the jailer. His calm demeanor and willingness to help were undeniable. He comforted other prisoners, listened to their stories, and worked without complaint. Before long, the jailer entrusted him with supervising the other inmates. "There's something different about you, Joseph," the man remarked one evening. "I've never seen someone endure so much and still hold on to hope." Joseph simply smiled. "God is with me, even here." Among the prisoners were two men from Pharaoh's court, the cupbearer and the baker. They had been imprisoned for displeasing the king, and although they were men of high status, the uncertainty of their fate weighed heavily on them. One morning, Joseph noticed they were especially troubled. "Why do you look so down today?" he asked. The cupbearer spoke first. "We both had dreams last night, but there's no one here to interpret them." Joseph stepped closer and said, "Interpretations belong to God. Tell me your dreams." The cupbearer began. "In my dream, there was a vine with 3 branches. It budded, blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in his hand." Joseph listened carefully and replied, "The 3 branches represent 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will restore you to your position, and you will once again serve him. When that happens, please remember me and speak to Pharaoh on my behalf, so I can be freed from this place." Encouraged by the positive interpretation, the baker eagerly shared his dream. "In my dream, there were 3 baskets of bread on my head. In the top basket were baked goods for Pharaoh, but birds were eating them." Joseph hesitated, knowing the truth would be hard to hear. "The 3 baskets also represent 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will condemn you, and you will be executed." 3 days later, events unfolded exactly as Joseph had foretold. The cupbearer was restored to his position, while the baker was executed. But despite Joseph's plea, the cupbearer forgot him, and Joseph remained in prison. Even so, Joseph remained faithful. He trusted that God was working quietly, and that every moment in the dungeon was part of a greater plan. Years passed slowly in the prison, yet Joseph continued to wait in silence. He knew the cupbearer had forgotten him, but his trust in God never wavered. Each dawn brought a new opportunity to believe that even in the darkest moments, God had a purpose. Meanwhile, in Pharaoh's grand palace, something troubling occurred. The king had two dreams that left him deeply unsettled. He summoned his magicians and wise men, but none could interpret the visions. Pharaoh's frustration grew with each passing day, throwing the court into disarray. It was then that the cupbearer remembered Joseph. Approaching the throne cautiously, he said, "My lord, when I was in prison, there was a young Hebrew who accurately interpreted my dream and that of the baker. Perhaps he could help." Pharaoh immediately ordered Joseph to be brought before him. Guards rushed to the prison, and Joseph was hastily shaved and dressed in clean garments. He entered the royal hall with his head held high, yet humility in his heart. "I've heard it said you can interpret dreams," Pharaoh said, regarding Joseph with curiosity. Joseph replied firmly, "It is not I who interpret, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he seeks." Pharaoh recounted his dreams. "In my first dream, I was standing by the Nile, and I saw 7 fat, healthy cows come out of the river. Then, 7 scrawny, ugly cows came up after them and devoured the fat ones, but they remained just as thin and ugly as before. In my second dream, I saw 7 full, healthy ears of grain growing on a single stalk. Then 7 thin, scorched ears sprouted and swallowed the good ones." Joseph listened carefully and said, "The 2 dreams mean the same thing. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 fat cows and the 7 full ears of grain represent 7 years of abundance in Egypt. The 7 scrawny cows and the 7 thin ears represent 7 years of famine that will follow." The hall fell silent as Joseph continued. "The famine will be so severe that it will erase the memory of the abundant years. Therefore, I advise Pharaoh to appoint a wise and discerning man to oversee Egypt. During the years of plenty, he should gather and store surplus grain to prepare for the years of famine." Pharaoh and his advisors were astonished. The king, in a moment of insight, declared, "Who could be better suited than you, Joseph? Since God has revealed this to you, there is no one as wise and discerning as you." In front of the entire court, Joseph was appointed governor of Egypt. He was given Pharaoh's signet ring, fine linen garments, and a gold chain. That day, Joseph rose from the dungeon to become the second most powerful man in the kingdom. As Joseph gazed upon the palace, he reflected on God's faithfulness. He realized that every year of pain, betrayal, and waiting had prepared him for this moment. The years of abundance came just as Joseph had predicted. Green fields stretched as far as the eye could see, and Egypt's granaries overflowed with grain. Under Joseph's leadership, every harvest was meticulously recorded and stored. He traveled from city to city, supervising the work and ensuring that nothing was wasted. The Egyptian people deeply respected Joseph. It wasn't just his position that commanded admiration, but his wisdom and humility. Despite his power, Joseph always acknowledged that his success was a gift from God. "It's not my intelligence," he would say to those who praised him. "It is the Lord who gives us wisdom and provision." Joseph married Asenath, the daughter of an Egyptian priest, and they had 2 sons. He named the first Manasseh, saying, "God has made me forget all my suffering and my father's house." The second he named Ephraim, declaring, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." But the years of abundance came to an end, and just as Joseph had foretold, famine followed. The rains ceased, the crops withered, and Egypt was engulfed in severe drought. Yet, thanks to Joseph's foresight, the people had enough to survive. People from distant lands began coming to Egypt in search of food, and Joseph managed the distribution with fairness. One day, a group of men arrived, dressed in worn clothing and carrying a visible weight in their expressions. They bowed low before Joseph, unaware that the man before them was the brother they had betrayed. Joseph recognized them immediately. The years had altered their faces but could not erase the memories of his youth. His heart pounded, torn between emotion and the need to test the character of those who had once sold him into slavery. "Where do you come from?" Joseph asked sternly, speaking through an interpreter. "We come from Canaan to buy food," they replied, not daring to lift their eyes. Joseph studied them for a long moment before declaring, "You are spies. You've come to find where our land is vulnerable." The brothers were desperate. "No, my lord. We are all sons of one man. We've only come to buy food. We are honest men." The irony of their words was not lost on Joseph. He continued questioning them, asking about their family. They spoke of their aging father, Jacob, and their youngest brother, Benjamin, who had stayed behind. "To prove your honesty, bring this younger brother to me," Joseph said. "Until then, one of you will remain here as a prisoner." The brothers exchanged troubled glances. "We are being punished for what we did to our brother," Reuben murmured. "We told ourselves not to harm him, but we didn't listen. Now we're paying the price." They didn't realize that Joseph understood every word. Hearing their confession, he quickly turned away, struggling to hold back tears. Despite the pain, Joseph knew that God was guiding every detail of this story. The journey back to Canaan was silent and heavy with unease. The brothers carried sacks of grain but left Simeon behind, imprisoned in Egypt. To add to their distress, they discovered their money returned in each sack, filling them with dread. When they arrived at Jacob's house, they recounted everything that had happened. Jacob's face darkened as he heard the Egyptian governor's demand to see Benjamin. "You have deprived me of my children," Jacob lamented. "Joseph is gone, Simeon is gone, and now you want to take Benjamin? No! He is all I have left of Rachel." Despite Reuben and Judah's pleas, Jacob refused to let Benjamin go. But as the months passed and the famine grew worse, he had no other choice. At last, he relented. "If it must be so, take gifts for the man and double the money. May God Almighty grant you mercy before him, so that he will release Simeon and allow Benjamin to return." The brothers set out for Egypt, this time with Benjamin. When they arrived, Joseph saw them from a distance, and his heart tightened at the sight of his younger brother. Yet he maintained his composure. "Bring these men to my house and prepare a banquet," he instructed his servants. The brothers, unsettled by the unexpected hospitality, feared it was a trap. When they were finally brought before Joseph, he asked about their father. "Is your father, the old man you spoke of, still alive?" "Yes, our father is alive and well," they replied. When Joseph saw Benjamin, he could no longer contain his emotions. He quickly stepped away and wept in private. After washing his face, he returned and joined them for the meal. The next morning, the brothers were sent off with their sacks of grain. But Joseph, still concealing his identity, instructed his servant to place his silver cup in Benjamin's sack. Shortly after they departed, guards stopped them and accused them of theft. Though they protested their innocence, the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, and they were all brought back to Joseph. "What is this you have done?" Joseph demanded, feigning anger. "Don't you know I can uncover such things?" Judah stepped forward, his face weary but his voice resolute. "My lord, God has uncovered our guilt. We are all your servants now. But please, let me speak. We cannot return without Benjamin. If he does not come back, our father will die of grief. Let me remain here as your servant in his place, and allow the boy to return with his brothers." Joseph was deeply moved by Judah's words. He saw a heart transformed, willing to sacrifice for others. Unable to contain himself any longer, he revealed the truth. "Everyone leave the room," he ordered the Egyptians. When they were alone, Joseph wept so loudly that his cries echoed through the palace. "I am Joseph, your brother. Is my father still alive?" The brothers were stunned, unable to respond. Joseph approached them gently. "Do not be afraid. It was not you who sent me to Egypt, but God. He placed me here to save many lives. Now, return to Canaan and bring my father back here. I will provide for you during the remaining years of famine." The brothers fell at Joseph's feet, begging for forgiveness. But he lifted them up and embraced each one, tears of reconciliation streaming down their faces. The brothers' caravan departed Egypt laden with provisions, gifts, and a mix of emotions. As they traversed the desert sands toward Canaan, they struggled to process the revelation that Joseph, the brother they had sold into slavery, was now the powerful governor of Egypt. When they arrived at Jacob's home, the elderly patriarch was sitting under a tree, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He stood as his sons approached, but his expression shifted when he heard the unbelievable news. "Father, Joseph is alive. He is the governor of Egypt." Jacob nearly lost his breath. "Joseph, my son? Is he truly alive?" The brothers insisted, showing the gifts and supplies sent by Joseph. Finally, tears streaming down his face, Jacob murmured, "My son lives. I will go and see him before I die." The journey to Egypt was long, but every step was driven by hope. When the caravan reached Egypt, Joseph went out to meet his father. As soon as he saw him, he ran and embraced him tightly. "Father, it's really you!" Joseph exclaimed, weeping. Jacob wept as well, stroking the face of the son he had thought dead for so many years. "Now I can die in peace, for I have seen with my own eyes that you are alive." Joseph brought Jacob and the entire family to the region of Goshen, a fertile land where they could thrive during the famine. He attended to every detail, ensuring they were well cared for. Even after their reconciliation, Joseph's brothers still carried a silent guilt. After Jacob's death, they feared Joseph might seek revenge. They sent him a message, saying, "Before he died, our father requested that you forgive the wrongs we committed against you." When Joseph heard this, he wept again. He called his brothers and said, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about the salvation of many lives. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your children." Joseph embraced them, sealing his forgiveness with genuine love and sincerity. The years that followed were marked by the prosperity of Jacob's family in Egypt. Joseph remained faithful to God until the end of his life, always mindful that every step of his journey, even the most painful ones, was part of God's divine plan. The years passed, and Jacob's family thrived in the land of Goshen. Egypt remained strong under Joseph's wise leadership, his decisions ensuring the kingdom's prosperity even after the years of famine. His name was revered not only by the Egyptians but also by neighboring nations, who recognized his skill and integrity. Joseph grew older, but his faith never wavered. He often gathered his children and grandchildren around him, sharing stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the promises of God to the people of Israel. He reminded them that, although they lived in Egypt, it was not their permanent home. One evening, under a star-strewn sky, Joseph called his brothers and said, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you back to the land he promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When that happens, take my bones with you, so I may rest in the promised land." Joseph's years as governor were marked by grace and compassion. He not only saved Egypt and many other nations from famine but also restored his family's unity, a living testament to how God can transform suffering into redemption. When Joseph passed away at the age of 110, he was embalmed and placed in a sarcophagus in Egypt, following the customs of the time. Yet his story didn't end there. Generations later, when the children of Israel left Egypt under Moses' leadership, they carried Joseph's bones with them, fulfilling his final wish. Joseph's legacy was far more than land or provisions. He left behind a powerful example of unwavering faith, integrity, and trust in God's plans, even when circumstances seemed insurmountable. His story continues to resonate through the ages, a profound reminder that God is sovereign, and his plans are always greater than ours. Conclusion. Joseph, King of Dreams, is not just a story of triumph but a call to trust God, even in the midst of our greatest challenges. Like Joseph, we are encouraged to look beyond the present and believe that God can turn pain into purpose and suffering into redemption. What did you think of Joseph's story? At what moment did you feel God's presence most strongly in your life, even amidst difficulties? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. This is the Embracing Narratives channel. May God bless you, and see you in the next story.